Ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure in presenting Dr. Brownstone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I first appeal to everyone to move down to the front rows. The television people have suggested that it will make for a much more effective television if we fill in these spaces. I hope you don't mind. It's all in a good cause. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would begin this session with apologies to Dr. Brownstone. May I take a little bit of your time? We are going to do a duty at this moment. We are going to rise up and observe a few seconds silence in honor of and in memory of the late Prime Minister of India, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, who was a national leader, and quite in keeping with Dr. Ambedkar's or the Ambedkarian tradition, that he respected all national leaders, and as such, we are only honoring Dr. Ambedkar when we rise and observe a few moments silence in memory of the late Prime Minister of India, the national leader, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi. Thank you. Dr. Brownstone.
For this afternoon's session, we're going to go somewhat beyond a focus on India and the human rights issue there related to the untouchables, to expand the agenda on the human rights question. Perhaps it refers to Dr. Ambedkar's dictum on these badges, in which he says, educate, agitate, and organize. Personally, I enjoyed this morning's session a great deal for its contribution to my personal education. Although I've done a great deal of work in the human rights field, none of it has been done with a focus on India, so it was very useful. When you move from education to agitation and organizing, I think that individual groups who are suffering within their country or part of a larger international group find immediately that in order to advance their interests in the human rights field or any other field, they need to link up with other groups and to attempt to understand each other's specific difficulties with human rights issues and to form some sort of transcending commitment to the struggle towards human rights. And this involves, I think, as we're trying to do this afternoon, to listen to other cases, other examples of human rights violations, in this case with perhaps a greater focus on Canada itself, involving, for this afternoon's discussion, a focus on Aboriginal peoples or Native peoples, a focus on women's groups, and a focus on refugees. Three of the very specific areas in which there is both national and international gross violation of human rights. The other part about agitation and organizing, which should be self-evident, is that most of our basic social institutions have failed historically in establishing a world in which human rights are practiced, in which equality is practiced, in which dignity is available to all people. We need only refer to the states as one form of social organization, and as we look at the world historically and currently, we will see state systems from so-called democratic to so-called less democratic, all engaged in one level or other of human rights violations, whether it's the gross repressiveness of states such as we find in Central America currently, a country like Guatemala, which we found very recently in a country like Chile, state systems which explicitly repress and violate human rights as a matter of policy and practice, to state systems in which there are constitutional guarantees, supposedly, which the state system simply does not apply in a way which meets the expectations and promise of those systems. So that, by and large, states have not been an example of a social commitment, a social organization, which has done very much internationally and historically about protecting human rights, although it remains, for all of us, an essential potential institution for the extension and protection of human rights. If we look at our vast economic organizations, and here I'm talking about the transnational and multinational corporations, here you find another social institution which has failed to guarantee human rights, whether it's human rights in the workplace or whether it's a kind of exploitive expansionism that multinationals have been engaged in historically and have created exploitive conditions throughout what is now known as the Third World. In fact, this kind of economic imperialism has provided the basic definition. They created the Third World. These kinds of exploitations, of violations of human rights are continuing through this mechanism. Now it's no longer called imperialism. It is called structural adjustment. It is called neoliberalism. But nevertheless, the impact in terms of human rights tends to be very similar to that suffered under more formal types of imperialism. And to take yet another example, the institutions, the religious institutions, and here I would refer particularly to those I know best, the Christian religious institutions. Again, we say here, I think historically, a failure to extend and honor human rights through the mechanisms of the institutions. The faith may be consistent with the development and protection of human rights. The institutional practice is a long way from this kind of realization. What this comes down to for me, and the kind of social organization to which I tend to be attached, that is the non-governmental organization or the popular form of organization, is that if there's to be hope for moving from a very sad history of human rights internationally to a more human situation, the only hope lies in meetings like this, in formations that are non-state, that are non-multinational corporations. I'd be a little more hopeful about organizations that are organized under the church rubric, the religious rubric. But I think throughout the world, the forms of human association that are most effective, becoming most effective in moving us to our goal of achieving decency and human rights are in fact people's movements or popular organizations that are not specifically linked to, directed by, or controlled by either the state or the huge economic structures. Well, I think what we're engaged in this afternoon in terms of, again, agitation and organization is, for me at least, the beginning of a linkage between popular groups, people's groups in India, like the Dalit movement, and groups and individuals in Canada who are engaged in their own context in really struggling for the same overall goal. So this afternoon, we will further the process of education and I think begin the essential first steps towards organizing an agitation or advocacy, if you like, by understanding each other. And we have two panelists this afternoon who will support this process. And first I will call on whom? I'll call on Rodney. Rodney Bobby-Rosh, who is in charge of the anti-racism program at the Native Canadian Centre here in Toronto. And he will deal with the linkage between Aboriginal rights and human rights on the one hand, and the basic issue of individual rights versus community rights, both of which are very relevant to the pursuit of human rights within Canada and I think Aboriginal peoples everywhere. Rodney?
Thank you. Anin, Rodney Dishnikas, Tesla and Dunjaba. When I start my talk, I like to use my own language because we're talking about self-government. And for us, self-government means that we use our language. It means that we govern ourselves in accordance with what we know to be the Indian way. And that's absolutely essential to any kind of understanding of how we view human rights, is understanding that for us we have to walk, we call it a red road. We have to walk the Indian way. And so what I said to you, I said Anin, which is basically hello. I introduced myself, Rodney Dishnikas. And I told you where I was from, which is the Teslon First Nation. It's where I'm originally from, which is on the north shore of Lake Huron. Those are important things to know. When Indian people identify themselves or want someone to identify themselves, they don't generally say, "What do you do?" Which is often the way in the Western world. When you say to somebody, "What do you do?" You want to locate them economically, you want to locate them socially. You want to know what job they do. Are they an engineer or are they a street sweeper? And that's fundamental to a hierarchical notion of value within Western society. For us, we generally the first question Indian people ask is, where are you from? When they say where are you from, they mean who are your people? Who is your community? How are you located within your community? Who are your family? And so if you were a part of my community and we were talking and you asked me where I was from, and I would answer I'm from Teslon originally, you would be able to locate me within the context of my father and my mother, his father, his mother, my uncles, my aunts. You'd also know that my family has lived as long as anyone can remember within one particular part, the North Shore, which is the Mississauga River Valley. You would know the connections that we have spiritually. You would know that I'm a Black Bear clan person, and I have a whole series of responsibilities associated with my clan. And if you were Black Bear clan, you could come to me and you could expect that I would fulfill those responsibilities and those obligations to you. We also have relationships with other clans. I'm telling you all this because I want to situate this talk very firmly within the context of community. In terms of human rights, this is perhaps where, in Aboriginal rights, this is perhaps where the greatest tension arises, is in the conflict between Aboriginal rights, or what we would refer to as community rights, and the notion of individual rights. This morning, there was talk about how human rights is very much framed within the language of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, equality, fraternity, the rights of the citizen, as opposed to the rights of the monarch. Right? As Indian people, we don't particularly uphold the rights of the citizen. We find that in a lot of ways to be disenfranchising, to be disempowering to our collective rights, to our community rights. And I assume this is a problem for Aboriginal people all over the world. And we're drawn into various legislative problems at an international level because of this conflict. And I think I will talk first off about Aboriginal rights in the context of international rights. If you take a look at the UN Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, or the various ILO conventions which deal with Aboriginal people. And even if you look at the more recent initiatives within the United Nations, the UN Working Group on Aboriginal People, the UN Working Group on Minority Rights, which are at this very moment trying to draft some kind of international declaration on Aboriginal rights. You realize that consistently the language that's used within those documents is the language of individual rights. But what happens then when somebody claims one of those individual rights which conflicts with rights that we see as paramount within our community? Labor laws, okay. The ILO has been, it's the International Labor Organization, has been in the forefront of leading international bodies of concern on Aboriginal people. What happens though in a case, and I'll use a recent case, and ELIJAH HARPER is going to be here this afternoon, and it concerns his band, actually, his First Nation, the Fort Alexander Band in Saskatchewan, where a labor union says that their workers are bound within Canadian law to enjoy certain rights of collectivity. And the First Nation says, you don't enjoy those rights because we have the right to fire you at will when you're on our First Nation. We have the right to govern you when you're on our First Nation. Women's rights are another example. That a lot of the support for Aboriginal rights in the Constitution was seen within Indian country to be suspect when it came from women's groups, because it clearly posited the position of women against the community rights as a whole in recognition of Aboriginal rights within the Constitution. And this led to a lot of time being wasted within those discussions. This led to an immense amount of fractionalism within the discussion as well. And it's become very clear, and the question here is not women's rights versus community rights, or labor rights versus community rights. The question is the right to self-determination. Whether or not we're going to be afforded the right to govern ourselves as we see fit, according to our way, or whether we're only going to be afforded the right to govern ourselves in as far as our rights are allowed to, as far as our rights are limited by those rights which are set down by the state. If the state can determine which rights we can exercise within our communities, then we don't believe that we have the right to self-determination. There's a problem. The other problem, of course, with the international law, beyond the emphasis on individual rights as opposed to community rights, is the ability to enforce. We'd like to know, for instance, why Canada has consistently refused to make 1992 the year of the Aboriginal person. We've been lobbying for years and years and years to make 1992 the year of the Aboriginal person. Canada has consistently stepped in and refused that resolution, using their powers at the UN. We know within the Aboriginal Working Group that's meeting to a draft declaration that Canada has on Aboriginal rights, Canada has refused to participate. They come to the meetings, they sit there in Geneva, they watch what's going on. Now we wonder if this is part of a strategy to let all the work get done first, and then Canada will step in at the end and say we don't agree with it, and they're going to kill the deal at the end. Why aren't they participating at this level? We know that 2 weeks ago the European Parliament passed a resolution which condemned Canada for its role in the Oka crisis, for a denial of basic civil rights and civil liberties to the people of Ganzatagi during the blockade last summer. But what impact does that have? The European Parliament is powerless to enforce any kind of sanctions against Canada. It's unrealistic to suppose that European nations are going to impose a boycott upon Canada. I suppose they could do that. The European Parliament could try and enforce that sort of thing. It's very unlikely it's going to happen. In bodies like the UN and the World Court, the World Court has made several significant decisions on behalf of Aboriginal people in Canada, against the Canadian state.
As you're going to hear me speaking, you'll be wondering what accent do I have. I was born in Zaire, and when I was 4 years old, we had to leave the country because my father was in the first government, and we had a military coup, and we left for Soviet Union. At that time, it was the country that was supporting the nationalist movements in Africa. So I went to Soviet Union at the age of 4, and that explains my Russian accent, which I later on mixed with French and Portuguese as I lived in different countries. So what was being a refugee meant? It meant not having an identity. I recall very clearly that when I arrived to Canada, what I was seeking most was an identity, which I got. I used to travel from country to country with a piece of paper that will state my name, where I was born, whatever address I was living at that time, and a little picture on the corner of that paper. That was my form of ID to travel. And I recall one time I was traveling from Angola to Ivory Coast to do an immigration interview for Canada, and arriving at the border, at the airport, they were asking me, "Oh, you are from Zaire? We love Zaire." And I asked them why. They play great music there. So that's the knowledge they had of Zaire. I was sponsored by WOSC, World University Service of Canada, and when I arrived, they had a different notion of the kind of refugee they were expecting. They were not expecting a refugee that will be intellectual. They had an image of this poor refugee in drag clothes, or, you know, the kind you see on TV or something like that. And so they were in front of a person that spoke 4 languages, and you know, I had the university degree and so on, and somehow it didn't fit their image of who they were expecting.
I am the completely new person in this country. I arrived here yesterday. The speaker just gave a brief survey about the population in this country. He also referred to the Indians. We observe on television in London or England, Indians means American Indians or Eastern Indians. I could not get a clue on this. If it is Indian population from Asia, then there must be Hindus. The official doctrine of Hinduism is inequality. Dr. Ambedkar says inequality is an official doctrine of Hinduism. The same people claim equal treatment from outside world, whether they practice equality in their own country and against the downtrodden people of India. It is possible for me to know from the speaker recently that whether they talk about human rights, whether they are practicing human rights against their own people. Are they right in that sense?
I will make it brief. I'm sorry that other engagements prevented me from attending your whole conference in honor of Dr. Ambedkar and his work on human rights. But I was very interested in what Dorothy Gazenga said about refugees. And I heartily agree with her that particularly, say, somebody of British descent, as I am, has an obligation to consider what is the origin of some of these repressive governments that have generated refugees, of whom a few have been able to come to Canada. And I believe it is quite necessary for 2 reasons that we take account of that. First of all, for straight humanitarian reason, that we should not be supporting these oppressive governments, which we too often do, we as the Canadian nation represented by our present government in Ottawa, though I'm not of the government party. But secondly, what I'm learning, especially in connection with Latin America, is that what is being done to those countries today will very likely move into our country tomorrow, or next day. In other words, it's not just a matter of sympathy or charity, it's a matter of solidarity with working people all over the world. Thank you.
I would like to add a few words in appreciation or trying to appreciate human rights as a spokesman in an international language of Indian Dalit poets. The word Dalit means oppressed. And while doing that, I would also generally like to speak about the impact of poetry and why you must understand and learn the poetry of the oppressed and give more time to it. Friedrich Engels has said, freedom is the recognition of necessity, but the recognition cannot come without realization. And you, after all, need an immense amount of compassion to understand want in society. One should be able to say, and I repeat, I'm going to add a little bit of poetry to whatever I say. Whenever a man is shot, all the bullets pierce my heart. The rivers of tears flow across the world right into my heart. This ideal type of realization, if at all it exists in very few stray individuals. One must try and understand that it does not exist on an informed society basis, and one must try to tell the society that to live by day is not to live at all. The struggle for human rights is a strenuous social battle. Some of us, of the oppressed, reclaim their human personality. Some of them struggle. Some of them give up their struggle. And some of them take advantage of those who have struggled and get themselves in a sort of a comfort zone. And then they forget their roots. All such experiences, just like the black poets in the United States, have been stored in today's poetry in India. And in fact, in India, if anything has made an impact, it is the Dalit poetry today. Why? Because it is intense, it is heartfelt. Dalits and Dalit poets have a lot to tell. Art ordinarily is the emotional expression of the ruling class, but no more, at least not in India, and I'm sure it's not in the United States nor anywhere else, because the rights of the oppressed, the human rights are to the forefront. Poetry is an important weapon for change. And I shall today, though there is hardly any time, I will try to give some idea as to how the Dalit poets in India are trying to become the inspirators, the historians, the educators, and even the agitators of the Dalit community. I would not take much more time. I will just say this because of the time limitation which I am told just now, that I wanted to quote a couple of poems, but I will not do that now. Beg your pardon? No, that's fine. That's fine. We have little less time. All I want to say is to use some nice closing words. And let me say this. Dalit poets, like all poets everywhere, have to make a very powerful statement. And the statement is this: always to shine, and everywhere to shine, and to very last to shine. And that is their motto, and so is that the sun's motto. And that is what was motto of Dr. Ambedkar.